Trapped in a remote desert canyon, a proud, midnight black Mustang found himself surrounded by determined hunters, each one eager to claim their trophy before the sun dipped below the horizon. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. The scorching afternoon light cast jagged shadows across the canyon walls, where centuries of wind and water had carved deep grooves into the sandstone. Shimmering waves of heat seemed to distort the air, and the scent of dust and parched scrub plants clung to every breath. It was here, among the blistered rocks and sparse vegetation, that the hunters had finally cornered the Mustang, a creature renowned for its speed, endurance, and indomitable spirit. The horse, dark mane whipping like a banner, flanks coated in sweat and dust, stared down his pursuers with wild, rolling eyes. He had outrun them for days, always managing to slip beyond their grasp, but the relentless pursuit had driven him into the deepest recesses of the desert. Now, with cliffs on one side and a sheer drop on the other, the Mustang appeared to have nowhere left to run. Dust billowed around him as he skidded to a stop, his powerful hooves scattering loose stones. A chorus of hoots and harsh laughter echoed off the canyon walls as the hunters realized the advantage was finally theirs. From a distance, anyone might have mistaken the Mustang's pursuers for some ragged posse of outlaws, each one dressed in sun-bleached clothing and riding a horse just as exhausted and caked in desert grime as its rider. They carried rifles slung across their backs, heavy coils of rope, and an air of ruthless determination that left no doubt as to their purpose. These men had traveled far for this chase. They had seen the stallion running free across the open plains weeks earlier and had made it their mission to capture him, either to break him for their own uses or to sell him at a distant market. Word had spread of the horse's impossible speed and proud temperament. He was rumored to be unbreakable, a wild spirit refusing the saddle or bridle of any man. That only fueled the hunter's desire. One among them, a wiry fellow whose sun-leathered skin and narrow, piercing eyes gave him the look of a desert hawk, raised his hand to signal the others. They began to fan out around the perimeter. Their strategy was simple: corner the Mustang in this box canyon, close in from all sides, and bring him down with ropes if a clean gunshot to wound him wasn't possible. The lead hunter, the hawk-eyed man, took careful note of the terrain. A tumble of large boulders blocked any easy way out along the southern edge, and the northern route was a sheer rock face rising impossibly high. The horse had nowhere to go but straight ahead into the arms of his pursuers. The Mustang's muscles twitched beneath his dusty coat. Foam dripped from his mouth as he panted, nostrils flaring, searching for a breath of cooler air. He could smell the hunters, their sweat, the horses they rode, and the faint tang of metal from their guns. He could taste fear in the back of his throat, but it wasn't his own. It was the fear that humans brought with them wherever they went. It was the weight of captivity that threatened to snuff out his freedom. With a heavy snort, he pawed the ground, ears pinned back, poised to charge. He had never been one to surrender. The men advanced carefully, rifles in hand. One man uncoiled a length of rope, letting it drag behind him in the sand, raising a small, silent cloud of dust. Another dismounted, clapping his horse's neck to calm it, and moved in on foot. The Mustang's ears twitched in every direction, listening for any shift in the gravel, any crack of a rifle's hammer being pulled back. He knew that to stay still was to become an easy target. He also knew that bolting blindly might lead him straight into a trap. Yet the blood pounding in his ears, the wild adrenaline coursing through his veins, urged him to act rather than remain frozen in place. With a sudden explosion of movement, the Mustang charged toward a narrow gap between two hunters. The men cursed and spun around, rifles jerking up, but the horse was a blur of black muscle, hooves striking sparks against rock. A shot rang out, reverberating off the canyon walls. A bullet kicked up dust mere inches from the Mustang's flank. He swerved sharply, pivoting on his hind legs with astonishing agility, and plowed onward. One of the hunters tried to bring his rope around, but he was too slow. The Mustang shot past him, the cord slashing through the air harmlessly. For an instant, it seemed the Mustang might break free after all, until he rounded a massive boulder and skidded to a halt. A jagged rock slide, possibly from a past storm or small quake, had dammed up the canyon's exit. The path was completely blocked by slabs of stone taller than a man. A sheer cliff loomed overhead, smooth and unyielding. The Mustang spun around, searching for another way out, but the hunters were closing in once more, corralling him back into the trap. Dust swirled at his feet, and his eyes bulged with the understanding that his options were dwindling to zero. He backed up slowly, head tossing in alarm as the men gathered in a rough semicircle, rifles pointed, ropes ready. One of the horses among the men snorted and stomped at the ground, sensing the tension. The hawk-eyed leader smirked, raising his weapon, and called out, "End of the line, you beauty! Don't fight us, makes it easier on us all." Another shot cracked across the air, this time whizzing just past the Mustang's ears. He started, jerking sideways, but didn't fall. His sides heaved, sweat trickled in rivulets down his legs. Every muscle in his body was drawn tight, ready to spring. He braced himself and leapt forward. Rope hissed overhead, a lasso whirling through the air. He ducked, muscles contorting, just as the rope slapped the ground where he had been. Two more lassos whirled, and the Mustang dodged one but felt another snap around his neck. The coarse fibers bit into his hide, and he whipped his head back in fury. The hunter holding the rope dug his heels into the dirt, leaning back with all his strength. The Mustang felt a sudden, strangling pressure, but he refused to be choked out. With a violent thrash of his neck, he pulled forward, dragging the man several feet through the sand until the rope slackened. The Mustang reared, hooves pawing at the sky, and the rope soared off his neck as the hunter lost his grip. The success was short-lived. Another man had managed to approach from the side, aiming his rifle low. A thunderous shot rang out. The Mustang let out a cry of pain as a bullet grazed his flank, a tearing burn that left a trail of blood staining his sleek coat. Staggering, he swerved away, hindquarters trembling. The pain was a savage jolt, like fire spreading through his muscles, but also a potent reminder that standing still meant certain capture or death. He had to keep moving. He tore off along the edge of the canyon wall, stumbling over loose rocks. He could feel warm blood trickling down his hind leg, but the desperation to flee drowned out all other senses. A man on horseback galloped in pursuit, rope at the ready. The Mustang darted behind a tumble of boulders, chest heaving so loudly it was all he could hear. For a moment, he was out of sight, hidden among the rocks and the thick haze of dust. He saw a narrow opening between two tall slabs, just wide enough for his body if he twisted at the right angle. With no other choice, he plunged into it, scraping his sides and cutting himself on jagged edges. Stones shifted overhead. It felt as if the canyon itself might crush him. When he emerged on the other side, he found a small plateau overlooking a drop of nearly 100 feet. The canyon floor stretched below in a jagged labyrinth of rock and sand. The sun glared high above, beating down with a merciless intensity. Behind him, he heard shouting. Some of the men had spotted him climbing up here. Fear exploded in his chest as he realized the plateau was a dead end. The sheer drop offered no safe descent, just certain death if he slipped. But backtracking meant going straight into the hunter's waiting sights. He glanced at the drop, then back at the narrow passage he had come through, trying to gauge any possible escape. Shouts rose, echoing around him, and the Mustang crouched behind a boulder, muscles tense. His breath came in ragged gulps. He could smell his own blood in the dry air. The rope burn around his neck throbbed, and the fresh bullet graze stung with every movement. A flicker of movement caused his ears to swivel. He peered around the rock to see the hawk-eyed leader step onto the plateau, rifle raised at the ready. Another hunter came behind him, rope coiled in his hand, and two more followed. They spread out, confident now that the Mustang was cornered. One of them whistled, a shrill, taunting sound. The Mustang's chest tightened. There was no easy way out, but he wasn't about to surrender his freedom for a rope around his neck. He snorted, muscles bunching, ignoring the pain. The men slowly advanced, forming a half-circle, blocking the path back to the rocky squeeze. If the horse tried to break that line, he'd be lassoed for sure, or else shot down. If he tried to leap from the plateau, the fall would likely kill him. In that heart-pounding moment, a primal determination flooded his veins. He would fight to the end. He stomped the ground, stirring up a small cloud of dust, then charged. The hunters scrambled to react, ropes swinging overhead. Gun barrels flashed in the sun. The Mustang thundered directly at the hawk-eyed man, who, taken by surprise at the horse's daring, backpedaled. At the last second, the Mustang veered, twisting his body to slam into the next hunter, who had his lasso raised. The impact threw the man aside with a shout of pain. The Mustang nearly lost his balance on the loose gravel of the plateau, hooves sliding dangerously close to the edge. He felt stones tumbling beneath him, rattling down the steep drop. One misstep, and he would be lost. A rifle blast roared behind him, the shockwave reverberating in his chest. He smelled sulfur and burning powder. The bullet must have missed, for he felt no new wound, but adrenaline spiked again. He wheeled around, sweat and blood spattering across the dusty ground. With a furious shriek, he lashed out with his hind legs, forcing another hunter to leap back to avoid being kicked. But now they were regrouping. There were 4 men up here, each determined not to let this prize slip away. The Mustang's mind raced. Horses like him weren't known for complex reasoning, but survival instincts honed over a lifetime of living free told him that if he stayed on this plateau, he would soon be captured. He eyed the narrow path leading back down. It was clogged with the other men, but maybe it was his only chance. Gathering what remained of his strength, ignoring the searing pain in his flank, he bolted toward that tight opening in the rocks. The men rushed to cut him off, but the Mustang lowered his head and barreled forward, hooves crashing against stone. A rope whipped through the air, looping over his neck. He grunted, feeling the choking tension instantly. The man on the other end tried to plant his feet, but the horse's momentum ripped him off balance. With a final powerful surge, the Mustang yanked free, the ropes scraping harshly along his skin but ultimately sliding off. The man toppled forward with a curse, face planting in the dirt. Gunshots exploded in rapid succession, but the horse charged into the narrow crevice. Rocks scraped his sides, the walls pressing in. He scrambled, nearly slipping on loose debris. Shouts echoed behind him. Finally, with a desperate lunge, the Mustang burst through onto the lower canyon floor, sending dust swirling into thick clouds. He was back where he had started, with towering cliffs on one side and a craggy path on the other. The boulders still blocked the main exit, and beyond them stood at least half a dozen more hunters, alerted by the commotion above. They pivoted on their horses, stirring up the desert's sand in a swirl around them. One by one, they aimed their rifles, forming a line that cut off any hope of heading deeper into the canyon. The Mustang's lungs felt like they were on fire, and every breath tore at his throat. Blood ran from the gash on his flank. He staggered a step, dust caking his muzzle, eyes wild and wide. Cornered once more, he could sense that this time the hunters wouldn't hesitate to unload a bullet if he tried to break free again. The leader, hawk-eyed and furious, slid down a rocky slope to rejoin his men, breathing heavily but with a wicked grin on his face. He shouted, "No more games! Drop him, or rope him, just end this!" The Mustang's ears pinned back at the finality in that voice. In the stifling silence that followed, the Mustang could almost hear his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The hunters spread out, forming a tight net. One of them raised his rifle, leveling it at the horse's massive chest. Another edged closer with his rope, ready to secure the Mustang the moment the shot took him down, or if he tried to bolt again. The canyon walls felt like they were closing in even more, the oppressive heat sucking every last ounce of energy from the Mustang's trembling muscles. He pawed at the ground, defiance blazing in his dark eyes, sweat burning in the fresh bullet wound, the taste of iron in his mouth. It seemed like only a matter of seconds before the final move would be made. Yet, just as the tension in the canyon reached a breaking point, a new and unexpected sound rolled through the dusty air, a deep, resonant growl, echoing from a cluster of rocks to the side. The hunters hesitated, eyes darting. The Mustang's ears flicked forward, and he turned his head, nostrils flaring. Emerging from behind a jagged boulder was a mountain lion, its muscular body low to the ground, tail twitching with focused aggression. The big cat had been drawn by the noise, the smell of blood, or perhaps the promise of an easy meal. Now it stood, staring at the group, pupils wide in the harsh sunlight, lips pulled back to expose fangs. The lion's presence instantly shifted the power balance. Fear flickered across the hunters' faces. They had come equipped to deal with a wild horse, but a full-grown mountain lion was an entirely different threat. One might spook a horse with gunfire, but a lion could leap into their midst before they had time to shoot effectively. The hawk-eyed leader gestured wildly, not sure whether to order his men to kill the lion or continue subduing the Mustang. The cat moved closer, shoulders rolling gracefully, hunger or aggression shimmering in its yellow eyes. For the Mustang, it was a brief, critical reprieve. The hunter's attention had momentarily shifted away from him. He swallowed air, legs quivering, mind racing. Danger lurked on every side, but the lion's timely arrival might offer a razor-thin chance of escape, if he could survive the chaos that was about to erupt. The Mustang's heart thundered as the lion let out another rumbling snarl, its voice echoing across the canyon. One of the hunters, panic plain on his face, fired a shot in the lion's direction. Dust and rock chips flew, and the lion recoiled with a furious hiss, but did not flee. Instead, it coiled its muscles and lunged forward, spitting and snarling, its powerful paws churning up the sand. The Mustang, seizing the moment, gathered his strength and broke into a gallop, hooves pounding in a relentless rhythm. The hunters were caught between two threats, an enraged mountain lion and a wounded but still powerful horse. A man tried to swing his rifle around to track the Mustang, but the horse thundered past with a burst of speed fueled by sheer desperation. Another man, rope in hand, yelled for someone to shoot the cat, but in his distraction, he failed to see the horse bearing down on him. The Mustang crashed into the side of the man's mount, the force toppling the rider from his saddle. Screams and curses rang through the dusty haze. The mountain lion, sensing that it had a chance, pivoted and sprang at the nearest hunter, claws extended, raking across cloth and flesh. More shots echoed, ricocheting in the confined canyon. The Mustang ducked his head low, feeling the heat of a bullet was past his ear, and raced onward. He realized too late that his path cut dangerously close to the lion's current position. As the cat and a wounded hunter tumbled in a thrashing blur, the Mustang skittered sideways to avoid them, nearly colliding with the hawk-eyed leader. That man snarled and swung the butt of his rifle at the horse's neck. The blow glanced off the Mustang's shoulder, sending a white-hot lance of pain shooting down his foreleg. He stumbled, almost falling, but at the last moment managed to regain his footing. With renewed panic, he plunged ahead, weaving through the scattered hunters and their spooked horses. Shots rang out in deafening succession, the canyon walls magnifying the sound until it felt like thunder. Somewhere behind, the lion let out an ear-piercing screech of either rage or pain. The Mustang pressed on, ignoring the burning in his flank and the sting in his shoulder. He felt his chest tighten, every breath painfully labored, but his spirit refused to yield. The chaos in the canyon was at its peak. Men shouted, horses neighed in terror, and the swirling dust made it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. This was the moment. The Mustang had to find a path to freedom. He followed the canyon wall, pushing through tumbleweeds and jagged rocks. One shot grazed a boulder next to him, chips flying into his face, but he kept moving. Ahead, he could make out a narrow gulch that sloped upward. He didn't know where it led, only that it might take him away from the heart of this madness. Putting every ounce of strength left into his legs, he galloped for the gulch, heart pounding. 2 riders spotted him and rode hard to intercept. The Mustang veered sharply, stumbling over a fallen hunter who lay groaning in the dirt. The horse's hooves clattered against stones, and he nearly toppled. Pain flared in his injured flank, threatening to drag him to the ground. But the wave of adrenaline surged again, and somehow, he stayed upright. The 2 riders closed in, one on each side, ropes at the ready. The Mustang's mind spun as he looked desperately for an opening. In a daring move, he slowed just a fraction, allowing the rider on his left to come even with him. Then, with a sudden surge, he lunged sideways, slamming his shoulder into the rider's horse. Startled, that horse reared, The rider nearly lost his seat, and the Mustang dodged past him. The other rider tried to close the gap, rope whirling overhead, but the Mustang ducked beneath the swinging loop, feeling the brush of the cord against his ears. Free of the immediate threat, he bolted up the gulch, his hooves kicking loose rocks that tumbled behind him. He heard the hawk-eyed leader's voice roaring commands, telling the others to give chase. But the lion's presence still caused enough turmoil that they couldn't all pursue at once. Some shots continued to crack through the air, but the Mustang pressed onward, focusing on putting as much distance as possible between himself and the hunters. The gulch twisted and climbed. Where it led he didn't know, but any path was better than being trapped in the canyon with those men, and that furious lion. Gradually, the rocky slope grew steeper, and the footing more precarious. The Mustang nearly slipped several times, hind legs skidding on loose gravel. His breath rasped in his throat like sandpaper. Blood still oozed from the graze on his flank, matting his dark coat. With each stride, pain lanced through his body. Yet fear drove him on. The possibility that the hunters might have found a quicker way around to cut him off lingered in his mind, pushing him to climb faster. The path wound between towering rock formations, occasionally narrowing to the point where he had to sidestep carefully. Sharp boulders jutted out, threatening to slash his skin. The desert sun blazed overhead, making every breath feel like inhaling fire. Behind him, the echoes of the hunters and their confrontation with the lion began to fade. He couldn't tell if the men had killed the beasts or if it was still harrying them, but for now, the chaos they had inflicted on each other was his best chance at escape. Yet he couldn't let his guard down. For all he knew, the hawk-eyed leader and his men might be racing up an alternate route or circling around to block his exit. He forced himself to keep going despite the mounting fatigue. Several minutes passed in a blur of dust and pain. Finally, the Mustang crested a ridge of loose scree. There, he found a rocky plateau that extended for a short distance before descending in a gentler slope. In the distance, the land opened up into rolling hills of scrub and sagebrush. Freedom beckoned, if he could just get there. His lungs begged for rest. His vision wavered slightly from exhaustion and blood loss. But the mere glimpse of open space fueled him. He staggered down the slope, muscles quaking beneath him. Below, he spotted a thin line of green that snaked through the desert, a trickle of a stream or a spring. Water. The promise of relief spurred him on. He carefully navigated the descent, sending rocks clattering down with each step, expecting any moment to hear the sharp crack of a rifle behind him. But no shots came. The desert wind howled gently, carrying only echoes. Once again, he found himself alone, if only for the time being. Reaching the base of the slope, he picked his way toward the ribbon of green. His eyes darted warily, ears swiveling at the slightest sound, half expecting to see a rider come charging over the ridge. But there was no sign of the hunters. Perhaps they were still dealing with the lion or tending to their wounded. Perhaps they were circling around. Either way, the Mustang had no illusions about being safe yet. He limped toward the stream, feeling each throb of pain in his flank as a sharp reminder of how close he had come to capture. At the water's edge, he paused, sides heaving. Clear liquid trickled over smooth stones, shallow but enough to quench his burning thirst. He lowered his head and drank deeply, water mixing with the blood and foam that coated his muzzle. The taste brought momentary bliss, a cool balm against the scorching dryness of his throat. Steam seemed to rise from his flanks as he stood there, letting the adrenaline ebb slightly. He could see his reflection in the water, wide, haunted eyes, sweat-soaked mane, dust-covered coat with streaks of red. This was the face of a creature pushed to its limits, but still alive. He lifted his head suddenly, dripping, muzzle tensed. A distant echo of hooves carried across the landscape. The Mustang's ears perked. He sniffed the air, and sure enough, he caught a faint human scent. The hunters hadn't given up. They were coming. He had no choice but to move on. Even as exhaustion tugged at his limbs, he knew he had to find a place to hide or a route to keep going, lest he fall into their hands again. Leaving the stream, he pressed onward through the scrub, keeping close to natural cover, large rocks, stands of thorny bushes, dips in the terrain. His injured leg trembled, The bullet grazed, sending fresh pulses of agony with every stride, but he refused to stop. Overhead, the sun reached its peak and began its slow journey westward, the air stifling in its heat. Vultures circled far above, drifting on thermals, as if anticipating a feast. The Mustang snorted, forcing his weary body forward, chasing the horizon. As the day dragged on, the terrain shifted slightly from sheer desert to a patchwork of broken hills and scraggly vegetation. The Mustang found a narrow valley with a dry wash running through it, offering a potential path forward. The ground was littered with river stones and bone-dry mud, evidence of flash floods during the rainy season. Now, it was just another dusty corridor, but at least it provided a bit of cover from prying eyes. He followed it, listening carefully for any sound of pursuit. Gradually, the wash dipped and swerved, leading him deeper between the hills. The oppressive heat and his wounds took their toll. Twice, he nearly collapsed, stumbling on shaky legs, the swirl of dust filling his lungs. Yet each time, he forced himself upright, spurred by the primal need to survive. The memory of ropes tightening around his neck, of bullets tearing the air around him, of the lion's furious snarl, all conspired to keep him awake, alert. Rest would come only when he found true safety. He continued on, step by step, each moment an exercise in raw willpower. The sun sank lower, stretching the shadows across the ground. A sliver of relief came with the softening light, though the warmth radiating from the baked earth still shimmered around him. He heard no further shots, no hoofbeats, only the occasional desert breeze whispering through brittle brush. Yet he knew better than to think he was free. The hunters were cunning, and they wanted him badly. In some ways, the silence was more unnerving than a direct chase. After what felt like hours, the dry wash opened up into a small basin. A few stunted trees clung to life here, and a patch of green grass indicated a possible water source below ground. The Mustang tested the air, smelling faint moisture, but he couldn't find an immediate pool. Still, the grass, if edible, might give him a chance to regain some strength. He walked warily, one ear always trained behind him, and lowered his head to graze. The grass was tough and bitter compared to the lush fields he might have known in calmer regions, but it was nourishment. Each bite helped ground him, giving him a moment to think. Nightfall was coming, and under the cover of darkness, he might stand a better chance of slipping past any watchers. But he also knew traveling in the dark and unfamiliar terrain could lead to broken legs or other dangers. He weighed his options in the instinctive, immediate way that wild animals do. Perhaps he would wait here, gather what energy he could, and move again once the last light had faded. The notion was risky. If the hunters tracked him here, he'd have nowhere to run. But pressing onward in his exhausted state risked a misstep on treacherous ground. He settled on a compromise, grazing for a short while, then pacing a loose perimeter around the basin to check for signs of danger. He found none, though footprints and hoof marks in the dry wash behind him confirmed that the hunters had passed near here before or might pass again. He noticed his own tracks and thought about how easily they might follow them. The desert offered little cover for tracks, though the shifting sands sometimes disguised footprints quicker than one might expect. He considered backtracking to obscure his trail but decided his energy was best spent recovering. He limped back to the center of the basin, mindful of every shadow. The pain in his flank had lessened from a sharp burn to a deep, throbbing ache. Blood had clotted around the wound, forming a crusty line on his coat. His entire body ached from the hours of struggle, and as twilight approached, the temperature finally began to drop, sending a chill through his sweat-soaked hide. It felt good, a relief from the punishing sun, but also a reminder that desert nights could be brutally cold, especially for a horse with injuries and a compromised ability to keep warm. As dusk fell, turning the sky from searing orange to a soft purple, the Mustang lowered himself carefully to the ground. A faint tremor ran through his legs, and he let out a low groan once he was finally down. The dry earth pressed against his flank, but he shifted to take the pressure off the worst of his injuries. He allowed himself a few moments of rest, eyes half-lidded, ears twitching at every rustle of wind through the brush. He caught his breath, his sides slowly rising and falling, dust and sweat mingling into a gritty film. Sleep was impossible. He was too exposed, and fear kept him alert. Instead, he dozed lightly, always on the verge of bolting upright. He thought of the hunters, of the lion's snarling face, of the terrifying crack of rifles. In that half-dreaming state, every faint noise turned into the approach of men with ropes and guns. His muscles tensed until a real noise jarred him fully awake, the distant clop of hooves. He rose to his feet in a rush of alarm, pain shooting through his injured leg. Carefully, he peered over a small rise. The moon had just begun to climb, offering patches of silver light that illuminated the basin. He scanned the horizon, searching for the source of the sound. Sure enough, far off, a single figure on horseback passed through a gap in the hills. The Mustang's heart pounded. The shape was no more than a silhouette, but there was no mistaking the rider's posture or the way the horse under him moved. It was one of the hunters, likely scouting ahead of the others. The Mustang stood statue still, blending into the shadows as best he could, even though his black coat might as well have been a beacon under the moonlight. He prayed the wind wouldn't carry his scent toward the rider. The silhouette paused, horse tossing its head. After a moment, the rider dismounted, as if studying the ground for tracks. They were too far away for the Mustang to hear any words, but he sensed a tense deliberation in the figure's movements. Then, as if reaching some conclusion, the man led his horse off to the left, disappearing behind a ridge. A tremor of fear and relief coursed through the Mustang. They were still hunting, still searching. His best hope was to move now, while the rider was out of sight, and leave this basin before a larger group arrived. Gritting his teeth against the pain, the Mustang gathered himself and set off at a limping trot, exiting the basin on the opposite side, heading deeper into a maze of rocky outcroppings. The moonlit desert spread before him in ghostly blues and grays, silent but for the whisper of the wind. Traveling by moonlight, his progress was slow. The land was uneven, full of unseen dips and sudden drops. His wounded leg cramped, and more than once he had to pause, panting, to keep from collapsing. With every step, he remained hypervigilant, scanning the horizon for any sign of the riders. He knew they were out there, forming a net that would tighten if he made a wrong move. Eventually, the land began to slope downward. He picked a careful path among the rocks, following the faint sound of water on the breeze. If he could find another stream or perhaps a ravine with thick brush, he might hide there until dawn. The idea of rest, real rest, teased at him, though he feared what daylight might bring. At last, he found a narrow defile in the rocks, just wide enough for him to fit through. On the other side lay a twisting gully with steep walls that shielded it from the moon's glow. It was nearly pitch dark, but darkness could be his ally now. He slipped into that gully, every sense on edge, feeling the walls press close. If this turned out to be a dead end, he'd be trapped again, but he had little choice. The alternative was to wander the open desert, where hunters would spot him easily. Slowly, carefully, he made his way along the gully's winding path. It felt like moving through a subterranean corridor, the stone walls towering overhead, the moonlight reduced to narrow slivers high above. The air was marginally cooler here, with a slight dampness that suggested a spring or underground water nearby. He tested the ground with each step, mindful of pitfalls or hidden crevices. He could no longer see far behind him, and he prayed that no one followed. After what felt like an eternity, the gully opened into a small clearing. At its center, a thin sheet of water trickled down the rock face, forming a shallow pool. It looked ancient, as if carved by centuries of trickling water. Stunted bushes clustered around the pool's edges, their leaves covered in a fine coat of dust. The Mustang approached warily, scanning the clearing for any sign of human presence. Finding none, he dipped his muzzle and drank, the cool liquid easing his parched throat. He made a slow circle of the clearing, trying to determine if there was any safe nook to lie down and rest. A natural alcove in the rock wall, partially hidden by spiny shrubs, seemed promising. He nibbled at the leaves of one bush, bitter, but edible, then poked his head inside the alcove. It was shallow but enough to provide a bit of concealment, and a place to lie down out of sight. The ground was sandy, scattered with small pebbles. Carefully he positioned himself, lowering his body with a trembling sigh. His flank throbbed, and a wave of dizziness swept over him. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the darkness wash over him. The only sounds were the soft trickle of water, the faint sigh of wind through the crevice, and the flutter of a bat's wings overhead. The desert night, for all its danger, also offered solace in its quiet moments. Here, he was not yet caught, not yet broken under a saddle or worse. He still had a chance, no matter how slim, to keep his freedom. As he tried to rest, flashes of the day's violence haunted him, the gunshots, the shouting, the lion's roars, the sting of the rope across his neck, the bullet tearing a path through his flank. Each memory jolted him awake, fear surging anew. Yet his body demanded rest, and exhaustion had a way of overpowering even the worst nightmares. He slipped into a fitful sleep, half aware of his surroundings, ears twitching at every stray noise. Even in slumber, he was prepared to bolt at the slightest hint of danger. In the depths of that restless doze, time lost its meaning. He awoke with a start to find the moon lower in the sky, on the verge of setting. A sense of dread filled him, because with dawn would come the hunter's renewed efforts, and possibly the clarity of daylight to track him. He couldn't stay here. He rose again, muscles protesting. His side felt stiff, the bullet graze crusted over but still raw. His neck stung where the rope had burned it. With a low snort he drank from the pool one last time, then ventured back into the gully. A faint pre-dawn glow stained the eastern horizon by the time he emerged from the winding passage. The desert rolled out before him in subtle shades of gray, dotted with the silhouettes of cactus and brush. He couldn't see any riders. Maybe they had gone a different way, or maybe they were waiting just out of sight. He had to trust his instincts. From the lay of the land, he guessed that heading northwest might offer more broken terrain, places to hide. The dryness of his mouth told him water might be scarce in that direction, but at least it would keep him away from the direct pursuit he'd faced in the canyon. And so he limped onward, forging a lonely path through the desert dawn. Each step was an act of will, each breath a reminder that as long as he could run or fight, he was free. As the first pale rays of morning light cracked the horizon, the Mustang pressed forward, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the men who hunted him. The sky shifted from muted gray to a gentle pink, outlining the jagged spires of distant rock formations. He felt a sliver of hope, fragile yet vital, whisper through his exhausted mind. Perhaps he had truly escaped them. Perhaps the lion's attack had scattered them beyond the point of regrouping. Yet a lingering fear kept his senses on high alert. Men like those hunters rarely abandoned a chase without a trophy. The chill of the desert night still clung to the air, offering a brief respite before the unrelenting sun climbed higher. The Mustang came upon a gentle slope of gravel that dipped into a wide, flat expanse of dried mud. Cracks in the earth formed a patchwork pattern, evidence of an ancient lake bed that had long since vanished. Sparse tufts of grass sprouted here and there, brown and brittle from the scorching climate. He stepped carefully, testing each spot for stability, the dryness of the ground sending loose flakes of clay rattling across the surface. In the distance, the Mustang noticed a lone figure on horseback cresting a small ridge. Instantly, his body tensed. His eyes narrowed, trying to discern whether it was one of the hunters or just another traveler. The figure halted, apparently spotting him as well, and raised a hand to shield their eyes from the early sun. The Mustang's heartbeat thundered once more. Run or hide? Out in the open like this, there was nowhere to hide. If he turned and bolted, the figure might give chase. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't one of the men who had tried to capture him. Then again, trusting a human he didn't know could be a death sentence. He decided the safest move was to slowly back away, keeping his eyes on the stranger. At first, the figure didn't move, just stared. Then, as if deciding the horse wasn't a threat, the rider turned and rode off in another direction, disappearing behind a rise of land. The Mustang exhaled a shaky breath, relief and suspicion battling in his mind. This encounter reminded him how vulnerable he still was. Continuing across the cracked lake bed, he kept a brisk pace despite his injuries. Every so often, he glanced behind him, expecting to see a group of riders come storming over the ridge. None appeared. He made it to a more rugged zone of badlands, steep clay hills striped with layers of red, orange, and white sediment, carved by centuries of erosion into bizarre shapes and narrow passages. This labyrinthine environment offered better cover, though it also posed the risk of getting trapped in dead ends. The Mustang picked his way through, stepping gingerly on crumbling ledges, ears swiveling at every echo. Small rocks clattered beneath his hooves, sometimes tumbling down into unseen gullies. It was slow, precarious travel. He spotted a faint trail winding through the hills, likely used by coyotes or other desert creatures. It was just wide enough for him, so he followed it, hoping it might lead to a safer area. The path corkscrewed between towering hoodoos, tall, thin spires of rock that loomed overhead like silent sentinels. A few large ravens perched atop them, croaking ominously at the intruder below. The Mustang ignored them, focusing on keeping his balance and scanning for any sign of pursuit. The sun inched higher, and with it, the temperature. Sweat began to slick the Mustang's dusty coat. He felt his wounds tug painfully with each movement, the dried blood cracking, sending sparks of pain across his flank. Yet he pressed on. The memory of that canyon ambush, of the gunshots tearing the air, of ropes whistling past his ears, drove him forward. Freedom was precious, and he would endure any hardship to keep it. Eventually, the trail opened into a narrow valley lined with sagebrush. The Mustang paused, lifting his head to test the air. It smelled fresh, but with a hint of something metallic and unfamiliar. He snorted, ears flicking in confusion. Then he heard it, a faint echo of movement, perhaps carried by the wind. He tensed, scanning the valley walls for anything amiss. A trick of the light, or perhaps someone moving just out of sight. A gunshot rang out. Dirt exploded at the Mustang's feet, sending him skittering backward in terror. Heart racing, he whirled around. There, up on a ledge, he glimpsed the silhouette of a man lowering a rifle. Another shape appeared beside him. The hunters. They must have circled around and found a vantage point from which to spot him in this valley. A second shot cracked the air, this time ricocheting off a rock behind the horse. Adrenaline surged anew. He bolted, muscles screaming in protest, flank throbbing. The valley floor offered little cover, so he sprinted toward the nearest outcropping of rocks. Hooves pounded, kicking up sagebrush and dirt. Another shot sparked off a boulder near his shoulder. He nearly stumbled, but recovered, pushing harder. His lungs burned, vision tunneling as panic took hold. With each stride, he felt the bullet graze protest, warm blood trickling anew from the aggravated wound. He gritted his teeth. He had to keep going. Shouts drifted down from the ledge. The Mustang couldn't make out the words, but he knew they were coordinating, calling out directions to box him in. He found a narrow cleft between two rock walls and ducked inside. The passage was steep, climbing upward at a harsh angle, but it was better than staying in open terrain. The Mustang scrambled up, hooves slipping on loose gravel, body jarred by sharp edges. He heard more shots in the distance, but they sounded muffled and uncertain. Perhaps the men weren't sure which opening he'd chosen. It was a grueling climb. His injured leg buckled twice, nearly sending him tumbling backward. Each time, he dug deeper, forcing his body to comply. At one point, he dislodged a cascade of rocks that rattled downward, echoing through the cleft. He froze, heart hammering, afraid the hunters might pinpoint his location. But no fresh gunshots came. For several agonizing minutes, he continued upward. The sun beat down from above, turning the rocky crevasse into a furnace. His mouth felt parched, and his entire body ached. Yet he pressed on, every step a painful triumph. At last, he emerged onto a plateau strewn with scattered rocks and scrub. The badlands spread out beneath him in a surreal tapestry of colors and shapes. He scanned the horizon for any sign of the hunters. To his right, the valley he had just fled from wound away, silent. To his left, the plateau stretched toward distant mesas. A faint shimmer hinted at a larger body of water or at least a mirage in the far distance. It was unclear. He stood there, chest heaving, eyes stinging with sweat. Despite the dryness, his coat was soaked with perspiration, dark patches of dust and blood marking his struggle. He felt a momentary flash of triumph. He'd managed to outrun their bullets once again. But he knew the chase wasn't over. They would keep coming, methodically checking every route. A sense of despair washed over him. Could he really keep doing this forever? Shaking off the thought, the Mustang forged on across the plateau, hooves crunching over stony ground. He kept his pace steady, not quite a full gallop, to conserve energy. Occasionally, he paused behind large rock formations to look back, verifying that no one was following. The landscape offered a slight advantage. There were many places to hide, to slip away. But it also meant he could stumble into a dead end or run into a group of hunters waiting for him. As he traversed a field of twisted juniper bushes, the sun climbed steadily toward noon. Heat waves shimmered, distorting the view of the land. The Mustang grew dizzy under the relentless glare. His thirst became unbearable, mouth and throat like sandpaper. He had to find water again, or risk collapse. His earlier plan to keep heading northwest in search of more broken ground still seemed wise, but the distance he'd covered had drained him. He could feel the borderline of his stamina slipping. A sudden, sharp whistle pierced the silence, echoing off the rocks. The Mustang spun around, muscles coiling. He saw nothing at first, but then glimpsed a man stepping out from behind a tall juniper. This one was older, with graying hair under a tattered hat, but his eyes burned with the same ruthless gleam as the others. He clutched a rifle in both hands, but he didn't fire immediately. Instead, he whistled again, as if calling to his fellow hunters. Then he raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel. The Mustang didn't wait to see if he would shoot. He lunged forward, dodging behind a large boulder just as the weapon cracked. The bullet sang through the air, smashing into stone. Chips flew, stinging his flank. The old man cursed, working the rifle's lever to chamber another round. The Mustang broke into a full run, weaving among the rocks in a desperate attempt to lose his pursuer. He heard the old man's voice bellowing, summoning the others, and more whistles answered from multiple directions. The Mustang felt his heart sink. They had encircled him. Bounding over a fallen tree trunk, he came face to face with another hunter astride a sturdy buckskin horse. This man flicked his rope, a lasso swinging overhead. The Mustang pivoted, kicking up dirt, and sprinted away. He heard the rider spur his horse forward, the thunder of hooves giving chase. Another rifle shot boomed, and he heard the distinctive thump of a bullet striking the ground just behind him. His mind screamed for him to run faster, but his legs were reaching their limit. Each frantic stride jarred his injury, sending agony lancing through him. Yet he kept going, adrenaline driving him forward. The rider pressed closer, skillfully maneuvering among the rocks to keep pace. The rope hissed, then snapped forward, and the Mustang felt it graze his shoulders before he ducked and jerked aside. Furious and frightened, he skidded around a tall spire of rock, losing the rider momentarily. But as he emerged on the other side, another hunter blocked his path, rifle aimed. The Mustang reared in terror, hoofs pawing the air, foam flying from his mouth. The shot roared, and a fresh line of fire ripped across his hide, a grazing shot that left him gasping. Staggering, he turned again, searching for any gap in the hunter's encirclement. The old man with the gray hair appeared, gun smoking. The hawk-eyed leader also stepped out from behind a rock, battered and dusty from the earlier chaos, but still alive. His expression held pure malice. The lion must have not finished him. Now they were all here closing in. The Mustang spun desperately, only to see 3 more men forming the circle, ropes at the ready. They advanced in silence, faces set with grim determination. The only sounds were the Mustang's ragged breathing and the crunch of boots and hooves on gravel. The circle tightened. The horse's ears flattened, his entire body trembling with exertion, foam flecking his lips. He sensed that this time, they would not be so easily evaded. Yet something deep inside him refused to surrender. His eyes flickered with the same wild defiance that had carried him this far. With a final, desperate scream, he lunged at the line, attempting to break through sheer force. 2 ropes lashed out simultaneously. One loop wrapped around his neck, biting painfully. Another tightened around his front leg, sending him off balance. He stumbled, muzzle slamming into the dirt, pain exploding in every nerve. Still, he thrashed, kicking wildly with his hind legs, refusing to be subdued. Dust filled his nostrils. Above the clamor, he heard the hawk-eyed leader shout, "Hold him! Don't let him slip!" Men pulled on ropes, straining with all their might, cursing as the Mustang's frantic struggle dragged them across the ground. Hooves struck out, nearly crushing one man's leg. Another man lost his grip and tumbled backward. But more ropes came, tangling around the horse's body, pinning his powerful muscles, restricting his ability to move. His vision blurred with dust and pain, and as he tried to draw a breath, the lasso around his neck pulled tight, choking him. His world shrank to the suffocating press of ropes and the thunder of his heart. Time seemed to slow. He felt the hot tears of frustration well in his eyes, a final wave of defiance coursing through him. The men's voices sounded distant, harsh. This was how freedom died. His spirit raged, bound in the dust by those who valued his power more than his life. In that moment, a sound split the air, a roar, deep and familiar. The mountain lion, battered but not yet defeated, burst onto the scene once again. It must have followed the commotion. The cat's appearance was a wild card. The men hollered in surprise and fear, some letting go of the ropes as they fumbled for their rifles. The Mustang felt a brief slack in the bindings, a gasp of air allowed back into his lungs. But he remained tangled, and the pain in his leg made it nearly impossible to rise. Gunshots erupted in a frenzy. The lion lunged at a man, claws raking. Blood sprayed as the man screamed. The hawk-eyed leader cursed and fired point-blank at the beast. The cat shrieked in agony, but still it lunged, bearing down on another hunter. Chaos reigned once more, dust and gunfire swirling in a lethal cloud. The Mustang, though momentarily free of some rope tension, was still largely immobilized, coughing and wheezing in the haze. Summoning every last scrap of energy, he thrashed, rolling onto his side, kicking out with his hind legs. He felt ropes snap or slip. One of the men had let go entirely, more worried about the lion. Another rope had slackened when the man holding it fell to the ground, injured. The Mustang jerked his head violently, the rope around his neck sliding over his ears. Rolling to the other side, he managed to stand on 3 legs, the fourth still entangled. Shots continued to crack, and dust stung his eyes, but he saw a small window of escape. He lunged forward, ignoring the excruciating protest of his muscles. The rope around his foreleg caught on a rock, tugging him off balance, but he yanked again, and the frayed cord snapped. Stumbling, nearly falling, he forced his trembling legs to keep him upright. He moved, hobbling away from the fight as more shots rang out. The lion roared once more, then went silent. Whether it was dead or had slunk away, the Mustang couldn't tell. All he knew was that the men's shouts were fading behind him. He pushed through the swirling dust, ignoring the pain, driven by pure survival instinct. Every step felt like it might be his last, but he moved with grim determination. He saw a steep rock ledge ahead, with the possibility of a path leading up. Anything that put distance and terrain between him and those men was worth attempting. He scrambled up the rocks, hooves slipping, breath ragged. Behind him, he heard the hunters shouting, though the words were lost in the echoes of gunfire and chaos. Blood trickled down his leg from the fresh rope burns. The bullet grazed on his flank tore open anew, and each step sent a jolt of agony through his entire body. Yet, impossibly, he kept climbing. The desire to live, to remain free, burned hotter than any pain. At last, he hauled himself onto a narrow shelf that overlooked the canyon floor below. Peering over the edge, he saw a jagged drop of several dozen feet at least, a death sentence for a misstep. But from here, he also had a view of the men below, scurrying after the mortally wounded lion, or checking on their own fallen comrades, too preoccupied to chase him at this instant. The Mustang blinked sweat and dust from his eyes, letting out a shuddering breath that seemed to rattle through his entire frame. The madness below played out in muffled echoes, but he knew this was his moment. If he could find a route across this ledge to another path, he might slip away for good. Slowly, he edged along the narrow shelf, rocks clattering down as he tested each step. The ledge wound around the rocky escarpment, revealing a precarious path that climbed higher still, toward a plateau that stretched beyond the canyon. Breathing like a bellows, the Mustang inched forward. A single misstep would send him hurtling to his death. The sun broiled above, intensifying every ache in his battered body. Far below, he still heard faint shouts and curses as the hunters rallied, presumably to resume their chase. Once they discovered his hoofprints leading up here, they might try to follow. But perhaps the difficult climb would deter them, or at least delay them enough for the horse to gain a lead. He navigated a particularly narrow bend, pressing his body against the hot rock wall. Pebbles fell away, disappearing into the depths. His heart slammed in his chest. Inch by agonizing inch, he traversed the ledge until it opened into a slope of loose shale. There, he found slightly firmer footing. Exhausted, he paused, legs trembling violently, eyes half-lidded. For a moment, he thought he might collapse entirely. The desert sun spun overhead, and the ground seemed to shift beneath him. Then he remembered the ropes, the gunshots, the lion's sacrificial interference, and a fierce resolve flared within him. He made his way across the shale, sliding in places, sending small avalanches of rock tumbling. Eventually, the land leveled out onto a broad plateau. The open sky stretched on, a scorching dome that offered no mercy. On the far side of the plateau, he saw a series of jagged hills that might lead to more open desert. Beyond that, perhaps, lay grasslands or mountains, anywhere safer than here. He had no plan other than to keep moving until his legs gave out, or he found sanctuary. Despite the pain, he broke into a limping trot, adrenaline fueling the last reserves of his strength. The plateau was mostly bare rock, dotted with occasional shrubs clinging stubbornly to life. Without hooves pounding behind him, he allowed himself a small measure of hope. Maybe the hunters were too occupied with their dead and injured, or the path was too dangerous for them to follow quickly. He would take every advantage he could get. At the far end of the plateau, he spotted a narrow pass that might guide him down to the desert floor. He approached warily, testing the edges, letting small stones clatter down to gauge the drop. It seemed survivable, a winding descent that gradually cut between towering spires of sandstone. With one last cautious look behind him, he stepped into the pass, navigating switchbacks of crumbled rock and patches of tough desert scrub. Pain pulsated through his flank with each footfall, and at times his vision blurred. Yet the desire for freedom propped him up, pushing him forward down the pass, closer to the desert below. By the time he reached the base, he could barely breathe. His legs felt like lead, trembling under his weight. Still, he hobbled into the shade of a rocky overhang, letting out a ragged sigh. In the distance, open desert stretched to the horizon, a sea of shimmering heat and shifting dunes. No sign of the hunters, at least not yet. The Mustang took a moment to rest, lowering his head, eyelids drooping. He was still dangerously vulnerable, but the simple act of pausing out of direct sunlight brought some relief. A feeble breeze rustled the scraggly brush, stirring the dust around his hooves. The Mustang inhaled, tasting the parched air, feeling it scrape down his throat. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the chaos of the last day, how close he'd come to losing everything. He also recalled the lion's sudden intervention, the unstoppable ferocity of a wild beast that had given him just enough time to escape. In a strange way, he felt a kinship with that creature, both of them fighting tooth and claw to remain free in a land claimed by merciless men. He jerked his head up at a distant echo, a voice, perhaps, or a trick of the wind. It was impossible to tell. But it reminded him that this was no time for complacency. Rest would have to wait. With a weary snort, he emerged from the shade and began his lonely trek across the open desert. Step by step, he hoped to leave the hunters behind for good, or at least gain enough ground to slip into some hidden corner of this vast wilderness. His wounds bled anew, every breath a struggle, but his spirit refused to break. He was still alive. He was still free. As the sun climbed mercilessly overhead, the desert became a shimmering crucible of light and heat. Waves of distortion rippled across the ground, making distant objects dance like phantoms. The Mustang trudged onward, each hoof step a small victory. His coat was lathered in a mixture of sweat and dust, streaked with dried blood. Flies buzzed around his wounds, a maddening annoyance he could only half-heartedly swat at with his tail. Every so often, the horizon seemed to blur into a hazy line, making him unsure if he was indeed making progress or merely walking in place. Yet he persevered, guided by an unbreakable drive to keep going. The midday sun was brutal, but he found pockets of shade in the lee of occasional rock formations where he could catch his breath. He noticed an outcrop of what looked like petrified wood, ancient logs turned to stone. There, he paused and found a bit of relief from the furnace-like air. He scanned the desert in all directions. Aside from swirling dust devils and the faint shapes of distant mesas, there was no sign of the hunters. The lull did little to ease his nervous vigilance. He half expected them to emerge out of nowhere at any moment. But as minutes passed with no pursuit, he let himself hope they had finally given up or that they had lost his trail in the chaotic aftermath of the lion's attack. The memory of ropes cutting into his flesh haunted him, urging him not to linger too long. He limped away from the petrified wood, aiming for a small depression in the land that might hide a water source. The monotony of the desert rolled on: cactus, sagebrush, the occasional bleached bone of some creature that hadn't survived. Over time, he found a faint animal trail leading across a hardpan stretch toward a cluster of rocky hills. Where animals traveled, water often followed. He followed this faint path, ears alert for any sign of danger, nose searching for the faintest hint of moisture. At last, as afternoon waned, he reached a narrow canyon cut through the hills. In the deepest part, shielded from the direct sun, a thin rivulet trickled over smooth stones. The Mustang let out a trembling nicker of relief and lowered his head to drink. The cool water soothed his parched throat, reviving him enough to stand a bit straighter. He carefully splashed some of the water onto his wounds, wincing at the sting but grateful to clean away the dust and flies. Resting there in the canyon's shelter, he realized just how exhausted he was. His muscles quivered uncontrollably, and his head hung low. Every nerve cried out for sleep, for the chance to heal. But the midday heat made it nearly impossible to rest comfortably, and fear still gnawed at him, urging him onward. He decided to stay in the canyon's shade until dusk, at least. It was a strategic choice. Traveling under the scorching sun would only weaken him further. Time drifted in a haze of pain and fatigue. He sipped water intermittently, occasionally dozing but never fully asleep. Shadows slowly lengthened on the canyon walls, painting them in soft reds and purples as the sun angled westward. Eventually, as the air cooled, the Mustang rose to continue his escape. He followed the small stream down the canyon, the babble of water a comforting companion in an otherwise silent world. Past the canyon's mouth, the desert opened again, but this time with rolling dunes of golden sand. They shifted gently in the breeze, their surfaces rippled like waves on a vast sea. The Mustang hesitated. Dunes were treacherous, and crossing them would be exhausting. Yet he saw no better route. Every other direction led to more rocky hills or wide, flat expanses of exposed land. At least among the dunes, he could hope to obscure his tracks in the constantly shifting sand. He stepped onto the first dune, hooves sinking slightly. It felt unstable, as if each step threatened to bury his legs up to the knees. Carefully, he picked his way along the crest. The wind tossed loose grains into the air, stinging his eyes and nostrils. Despite the hardship, the relative openness allowed him to spot potential threats from a distance. Thus far, he saw no sign of riders. Nightfall approached quickly, the sky transforming into a mosaic of orange, pink, and purple. The desert air cooled in a matter of minutes. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the Mustang allowed himself a brief rest on the leeward side of a large dune. He took shallow breaths, focusing on the rhythmic dance of the sand in the wind. The bullet wound on his flank had finally stopped bleeding, but the area was raw and tender. Rope burns on his neck and leg throbbed with each pulse of his heart. Yet, in the quiet of dusk, he felt a spark of gratitude for being alive. Gradually, the stars emerged, countless points of silver in a deepening sky. Without the searing heat, the Mustang felt a second wind returning. He stood, shaking off the clinging grains of sand, and continued across the dunes by starlight. Each crest he ascended offered a fleeting glimpse of the surrounding desert, bathed in moonlight when the moon rose. The night was eerily beautiful, and if he weren't in constant fear for his life, he might have found it calming. He pressed on for hours, guided by instinct and the faint glow of the moon. The dunes seemed endless, but eventually, they gave way to firmer ground, flat, barren plains dotted with an occasional cactus. The Mustang paused to rest beneath a tall saguaro cactus, the moonlight casting long, spindly shadows. He listened. Only the soft breath of the wind answered him. No hoofbeats, no human voices, no whistling rope. For the first time in what felt like eternity, he began to believe he might have truly slipped free of the hunter's net. Still, he didn't allow complacency. He continued moving, though at a slower pace, giving his wounds the gentlest treatment possible while maintaining forward progress. The desert stretched onward, silver under the moon, a domain of loneliness and subtle beauty. He navigated around patches of prickly pear cactus, stepping carefully to avoid hidden spines. Occasionally, he heard the howl of a coyote or the rustle of a nocturnal creature scurrying through the brush. Those sounds, natural and wild, reminded him of the life he fought to protect. As hours passed, the Mustang started to feel the toll on his body once again. Adrenaline ebbed, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. The bullet graze ached, rope burns throbbed, and every muscle felt strained to its limit. He found a rocky depression that offered partial shelter from the cool night wind and settled there. The moon hung high, illuminating the desert like a ghostly lantern. He lay down, body trembling, and closed his eyes, letting the sound of the breeze lull him. This time, sleep came more heavily. He dreamed of a time before the hunters, galloping across open plains, a warm wind in his mane, no restraints or fear. In that fleeting reverie, he was free in every sense of the word, bounding over tall grass under a wide sky. But the dream turned dark, images of gun barrels and ropes intruding, and he jerked awake, heart pounding. The moon had moved across the sky, indicating a few hours had passed. Though still tired, he stood up, sensing it was safer to keep moving under cover of darkness. He continued through the night, the terrain shifting gradually from hardpan to cracked clay, reminiscent of the dried lake bed he'd crossed earlier. Dawn approached in a slow blossoming of pale light. The Mustang could hardly keep his eyes open, each step a monumental effort. Finally, unable to go farther, he found a shallow ravine with scattered rocks and low shrubs. He collapsed there, sides heaving, deciding to rest once more. As the sky brightened, he braced himself for renewed tension. If the hunters were anywhere nearby, daylight would make him easier to spot. But as the morning wore on, the sun creeping over the horizon, there was still no sign of them. Cautiously, he rose and drank from a dew-laden shrub, thankful for any moisture. He gazed out across the ravine, watching the desert come alive with the morning's light. Lizards scurried across warm rocks, and a lone jackrabbit bounded through the brush. Everything seemed deceptively peaceful. He spent the day moving slowly, favoring his injured leg, pausing whenever he found a bit of shade. With each hour that passed without hearing the hunters, he felt the weight of fear lighten slightly. Perhaps they had indeed given up, or perhaps they believed he'd died of his wounds in the harsh desert. Whatever the reason, the Mustang wasn't about to question his luck. Survival was all that mattered. By midday, the heat became oppressive once again. He located a scraggly mesquite tree at the edge of a shallow arroyo and settled in its patchy shade. Hunger gnawed at him, and he nibbled on the tough leaves. They were bitter, but it was enough to quiet his rumbling stomach. His wounds had begun to scab over, but they remained tender and easily aggravated by movement. A dull ache radiated from his flank, and he shivered despite the heat whenever a wave of pain passed through him. It was here, under that meager shade, that he finally allowed himself to acknowledge a truth: he had survived something extraordinary. Countless times he could have been shot, roped, or finished off by that ferocious lion's intervention turned chaotic. Yet here he stood, battered but unbroken. A sense of grim pride swelled in his chest. He had faced a threat unlike any he'd encountered in the wild, and he had endured. Toward late afternoon, as shadows lengthened once more, he ventured out of the arroyo and continued westward. The land began to change subtly. Gentle hills appeared, covered with low brush, and in the distance, he thought he saw greener vegetation, a sign of more consistent water. The possibility of a better habitat beckoned. Spurred by cautious optimism, the Mustang pressed forward, ignoring the pang of his wounds. With each step that carried him farther from that cursed canyon, he felt a weight lifting from his spirit. Night fell again, softer this time, the sky streaked with bands of lavender and gold. As the Mustang picked his way around the base of a hill, he noticed a small copse of trees that seemed out of place in the desert's dryness. Investigating, he discovered a hidden spring, its water clear and cool, seeping from a rocky seam. Tall grass and reeds fringed the pool, and the air smelled of damp earth, a rare treasure in this arid land. He drank his fill, the freshest water he'd had in days, and gently lowered himself onto a patch of soft grass. Here, under the stars and a gentle breeze, he at last felt safe enough to let his guard down. He lay quietly, ears twitching at the soothing chorus of crickets. Gazing at the moon's reflection in the pool, he considered all he had endured. The hunters, the bullets, the ropes, the mountain lion, each moment had seemed to spell his end, yet fate had steered him to this sanctuary. He closed his eyes, sinking into a deep, overdue slumber, lulled by the comforting hum of life around him. When dawn arrived, warm and bright, the Mustang awoke to birdsong echoing through the trees. He rose, stiff but alive, the fresh air filling his lungs with renewed vigor. His scabbed wounds pulled painfully as he moved, but they were healing. He drank again from the spring, water trickling down his muzzle and washing away some of the dust that clung there. The grass, though coarse, tasted heavenly compared to the bitter shrubs he'd survived on before. He spent the morning grazing and resting, the tension in his body finally easing. He remained alert, but no sign of riders or gunshots disrupted his peace. Every so often, a part of him expected the hawk-eyed leader or another hunter to burst through the trees, rope in hand. But as hours passed in silence, the horrors of the chase began to fade into memory. By midday, the Mustang decided to explore further. The land beyond the spring was gently rolling, dotted with more patches of greenery than the endless desert behind him. Perhaps he would find a herd of wild horses in these parts, or maybe he would continue roaming alone. Either way, he would do so without the weight of rope or saddle upon his back, as free as the wind that rippled his dark mane. Stepping out into the sunshine, he paused to look over his shoulder, as if expecting one final glimpse of the nightmare he'd escaped. Only the quiet rustle of leaves and the soft babble of the spring answered him. He exhaled, long and slow, then turned away, walking toward the unknown horizon. The Mustang bore the scars of his ordeal, yet they were also badges of his unbreakable spirit. He moved on, one step at a time, each movement carrying him farther from violence and closer to a life lived on his own terms. Somewhere behind him, the hunters might still be nursing their wounds, cursing the day they encountered this wild stallion with defiance in his eyes. Maybe they'd think twice before underestimating the power of a creature that refused to yield. Or maybe they would be foolish enough to try again. If so, the Mustang knew he'd fight them to the end, because that was who he was, wild, free, and unbound by any man. The sun climbed higher, casting shifting patterns of light through sparse clouds. In that golden glow, the Mustang's coat shone despite the dust and dried blood, a testament to his enduring vitality. His gait was uneven, favoring his wounded leg, but his head remained high, ears perked. He was an echo of all things untamed in this world, a symbol of resilience that refused to be subdued. Each breath he drew was an act of rebellion against those who sought to break him, each heartbeat a reminder that freedom can never be fully caged. And so he continued onward, embracing the unknown road ahead with the same fierce determination that had carried him through the hail of bullets and the ring of ropes. The desert behind him might hold the memory of his near defeat, but it could not claim him. His spirit soared above the hardships, leaving the hunters, their greed, and their violent ambitions in the dust. In his wake, he left hoofprints that spoke of defiance and survival, and in his heart, a song of wild independence rang clear. If this tale of struggle and perseverance left a mark on you, Be sure to like, subscribe, and share. The story of a Mustang who refused to bow to the cruelty of hunters is a testament to the unbreakable spirit that resides in every living being, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the will to remain free can triumph against all else.